Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
All right, welcome back. It's our tradition before we begin a talk to just go around and introduce ourselves briefly. My name is Peter.
I'm Larry Wish.
I'm Marty.
Asa.
Norman.
Will.
Paul.
Richard Adelini.
Ray Dyer.
Dean Penalty.
Clint Seitzer.
Tim Stewart.
Jack Buzzley. And Brent Calderwood.
Lee Robbins.
Peter.
Mark.
Jim.
George.
Baruch Golden. Chris.
Peter.
Peter.
Rich.
David.
Martin.
Oh, Mark. Hi, guys.
Bill.
Jay.
My name is Guy.
Craig.
Daniara.
Kei Matsuda. Max.
Mark.
And Lynn is our guest speaker. Who is new today? Anyone? Your name again?
Mark.
Mark, and you're Peter?
Peter.
Okay, so please welcome Mark and Peter during the tea and cookies hour later on. We'll have some announcements about how everything works too. I would like to introduce our guest, Lin Maslow. Gensha Lin Maslow is a Zen priest in the tradition of Shunryu Suzuki, who was ordained by Chikudo Lewis Richmond in 2006. Deciding that he wasn't just a theist at age 17, he abandoned his Jewish religion of origin, searching for a more direct and enriching spiritual practice. He began practicing Zen Buddhism at the Tassajara Zen Mountain Center in 1980. There were several years of deep involvement with the Radical Faeries in the 1980s, so he blends more than one tradition. He practices with the Vimala Sangha in Mill Valley. Is that right, Vimala? And we have the web address for Vimala Sangha in the newsletter if you want more information, where he aspires to attain nothing except a partner when the time is right, like so many of us, like now. Maybe very, very now. And he works as a hospice nurse. Would you like to do the bowing first?
I would, if that's okay. Hope bowing doesn't offend anyone. There's always so much arranging in Zen. Well, good morning. I'm very happy to be here. That was a pretty good introduction. I wrote it myself. When I was asked to speak here, I asked if there was any topic that might be useful, and I was told that
people often wanted to hear about relationships. And I went, great, what do I know about relationships? But then I thought, that's good, because what do I know about anything? Which is kind of our Zen way. So actually, I was in a relationship until about a year and 3 months ago for 12 years, and learned a lot in that relationship. So maybe some of what I say will be helpful. Hopefully, you'll find something there. I did make some notes. I did think that I would title this talk Staying Power. And the reason I chose that is because recently I was assisting with a tea ceremony at Green Gulch where I study tea. And the host was explaining how in tea, a lot of the tea utensils have poetic names, which is a very nice custom. Usually tea or Zen masters will name tea scoops or tea bowls. And, Twilight Awakening or something. Very poetic. And she was explaining to the group that we don't have anything like that in English, really. And I thought, but we do in the gay subculture, we have double entendre, which comes up quite a bit. So what I meant by staying power was, how do we, when we're practicing, stay with the thoughts and feelings that are coming up? And that's our basic practice. So whatever we are trying to apply that to, whether it's our work, our relationship with relationships, we can always come back to the fundamentals of what it is we're practicing about. So in terms of relationships, it seemed to me that maybe there were a few positions, and you may find yourself in one of these. There are people who are in relationships, there are people who want to be in relationships, and there are people who don't want to be in relationships. And then, of course, in the relationship group, there are people in the relationship who want to be in the relationship and people who don't want to be in the relationship. So there's a broad spectrum here. And I was thinking that, when we're considering our relationship to relationships, we have to sort of look at what we want out of it and how we can practice with that. And we can look at our intentions and our actions and the results. And intention, I thought, was a better word than, let's say, motivation. I heard Jack Kornfield once say that motivation is never pure. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But we can actually look at our intention and have a sense of whether or not it's pure. Kind of like when we're looking at desire in general. It may be useful to think of things rather than right or wrong as wholesome or unwholesome. You can kind of use that to begin to train yourself to take maybe some of the judgment off that you bring to yourself, to your habits, and to your self-centeredness, which are probably our two main obstacles in opening up to, as Suzuki Roshi used to say, things as it is. The way things really are, rather than the way we're perceiving them or experiencing them based on our habits and patterns of mind. So I think what we kind of see here is that we have to look at the nature of reality and the duality that we sort of experience it with. Because in Zen in particular, non-duality is one of the main Buddhist teachings that we focus on. And just yesterday I went to the San Francisco Zen Center to hear Huitsu Suzuki Roshi, who is Suzuki Roshi's son. He was here giving a talk. And he said something, I thought I'd share with you that I thought interesting. He was talking about sitting meditation, and he said that the only reason we sit is, and then he got kind of poetic in the way that tea utensils are, small breath, cosmic wind. And I thought that was really stunning, that he managed to capture this sort of duality of not one and not two, which is sort of how we are striving to practice, I think. So when we're sitting, in our tradition we focus on our breathing, and most traditions are some awareness of breathing. And that's for a lot of reasons. It's to help you let go of your thinking, but it's also to be aware of your body, because, when we do this, we're sort of bringing body and mind together, and that's what we do when we sit. And this non-duality can, extend out into everything we do, because we're basically a relative experience of reality amid the ultimate experience of reality. And as you know from Buddhist teachings, we don't often see this ultimate reality because of our conditioning and the way that we've been taught to think and regard our thoughts. So I thought the main thing it might be useful to talk about today is thinking. And when Peter was saying, please turn off all devices that make noise, I was like, does that include the mind? Can we turn the mind off? In my studies, I think a lot of advanced teachings say you can actually quiet the mind pretty much, and we should all live so long. But I think for us, just looking at our mind is a good way to begin. So the way I like to think of sitting and Buddhist practice in general is that it's really about awareness. You can put aside concepts like enlightenment and awakening, because basically when you're leading a life that's founded on the principles of awareness, you will find that the world around you is transformed. And I think that's the great teaching of Buddhism, is that we can transform our experience. And the Buddha was very big on saying, don't believe a single word I say, go out and check it out for yourself. And that is the message, I think, of Buddhism, is that Buddha nature is in fact in everything, and that we are able to have that experience. So I'm going to bring in a book that I think is really useful that I just got turned on to. It's called Train Your Mind, Change Your Brain by Sharon Begley. And this came out of the 2004 conference, one of the Mind and Life Institute conferences that the Dalai Lama has been organizing for about 10 years, bringing Buddhist scholars and neuroscientists together to look at the correlations between neuroscience and meditation. And what they're finding is presenting us with a wealth of information, but also a very strong affirmation of what Buddhists have known for about 2,500 years, that we actually have something to do with the way we experience reality. It's really hard to believe. But if you're a Tibetan Buddhist and you have experience with the Lojong mind training slogans, that's part of the way you can begin to cultivate awareness of what's actually going on in your mind. I mean, when we sit, I don't know what traditions you're all in, but, when you're following your breath and being aware of your posture, in Zen we sort of teach that sitting and what we call Zazen meditation is sort of like a karma-free zone. That just sitting here quietly focusing on your breath and observing mind isn't generating karma one way or the other. And by karma, I don't mean the good karma, bad karma, pop interpretation that many of us are stuck with, because karma just means action. But the broader understanding of karma is that actions have effects, and that actions actually are the results of also of causes and conditions. So when you have that attitude or understanding of your actions, just that awareness will begin to change them. Hopefully that's your experience in meditation practice. And if not, then keep at it, because that's what I mean by staying power. A lot of people get discouraged in Buddhist practice. I've heard teachers say that people come to them and say, I've been sitting for 25 years and I'm still not enlightened. And I think one of the brilliant things that Suzuki Roshi did for us was he told us that we should sit with no gaining idea. Well, that's really hard because we think we're going to be a better person, we think we're going to learn how to control our desires and our thoughts. But actually, if you have any idea like that, you've already missed the point before you even sit down. So I think if we're willing to understand what our thinking is, then we can begin to see the transformation possibilities in our actions and words. So basically, mind is infinite and universal, and we're all part of mind, I suppose you could say. And the function of mind is to think. And our relative bodies here are kind of confluence of what we call in Buddhism skandhas, the perceptions, form, feeling, sensation, perception, that kind of thing, which have objects. And so in practice, we can understand that there really isn't this distinction between subject and object. We can actually have this direct experience of this through practice and through concentrated effort and awareness. And if you don't believe that, just stay with it. Because you'll find that the more you sit, the more things change for you. And it may not always be obvious or good. In Zen we sort of have the sudden and gradual divide. That awakening happens suddenly, like in all the koans, where the pebble hits the bamboo and so had great awakening, blah, blah, blah. What does that mean for us today? So when we begin to look at our thinking, we're taught, well, come back to your breath. If you notice your mind is going off on your thinking, just come back to your breathing. But I'd like to actually invite you to look a little more closely at the thoughts. Not so much the content, but more maybe the rhythm, or the implication, or the subject without the content. The content, is often based on what we see or hear, but related to thoughts are feelings, but feelings are sort of more felt in the body, and we think of them as somehow less impermanent and more real and more of a reflection of our personality or who we think we really are. And my teacher is really big on teaching that practice is really about dealing with emotions. And I think a lot of people are taught early about thinking and thoughts and how to not do that, and there's a lot of emphasis on if I could just quiet my mind, and and I don't know what the if is about. I was up in Oregon last year during a retreat, and the Zen teacher told me that when young people come to the monastery up there, it has taken 2 years for them to stop hearing music in their heads when they sit. And I'm sure we've all had some of that. But I think as we look around at our culture, it's easy to see that we thrive on distraction and we thrive on entertainment and things that actually distract us from looking at what's going on in our mind. And luckily we have practice to help us with that. And when we come together in a group like this, it's really nice because we can actually experience that all things are supporting us and helping us. And in Zen we call that embracing and sustaining all being. And when you practice on your own, it's a little harder maybe to get that, but it's still just as true. But it's maybe easier in a group like this when, the quiet of however many people there are seen together is something very palpable and encouraging, at least to me. I hope it is to you. So the reason I mention this book is because it's sort of like the Tibetan mind training slogans. What neurology is finding out is that our brain actually isn't hardwired. A long time, the current paradigm in neuroscience was that by the time you're late adolescent, early adult, your brain is pretty much hardwired and fixed and immutable. And immutable was like a key word going back to the early 1900s to describe the actual architecture and structure of the brain. But recent advances in science have shown that actually thinking and the way we think about our thoughts actually changes the way that neurons interact and relate and grow. And they have found that people who lose a certain function area in their brain, like hearing, actually other parts of the brains can take over those functions, which people never thought could happen. So this book, which I haven't actually finished, but I'm enjoying very much, is talking about the ways that our relationship to our thinking can actually change what's going on in our brain. So this should be encouraging news to most of us. Because we're such a product of our habits, and our habits are, usually ways that we react to things that have sort of a protective function, and often are a way that we have devised to keep ourselves from experiencing what's really going on. So if we can look at our habits a little objectively, we might be able to let go of them. And this relates to the practice of letting go of your thoughts. So when I say staying power and staying with it, what I'm talking about is staying with letting go of things, which is kind of a nice little irony. Because, if you're just sitting and you find yourself getting very distressed and you look at what you're thinking about, that can be very upsetting. And you can begin to tell yourself things like, but that's just a thought. The thoughts aren't real. Just like the teaching in Buddhism that there's nothing here that you can say is an inherent independent self. In each of us, there's nothing you can point to or find that is your own unique self. And it's sort of the same with our thoughts. They're just impermanent. They're just, in Zen we're taught that they're like clouds. They're just kind of floating through the sky, and we can notice them, but we don't have to watch them trail off forever. And that is the practice. It's a very difficult practice because it takes a really strong intention. I got into this discussion with this woman the other day about, she said she doesn't practice because she thinks it takes too much discipline. And I hate that word. So I tried to find a way to talk to her, and I ended up focusing on intention with her, which she could really relate to. Whereas discipline was such a negative for her. And in my Sangha in Mill Valley, the Vimala Sangha comes from an ancient Chinese sutra called the Vimala Sutra. And Vimala was a householder at the time of the Buddha, who was probably considered to be wiser than all the bodhisattvas. And it's been a play, but the reason I mention is our Sangha is really geared toward busy Marin types who want to find some way to incorporate practice into their life. So it's very challenging because, I come out of the residential practice center model where you have the kind of group support that makes it hard to not get up at 5 o'clock or whatever. But in our daily lives, we have to build in these kinds of supports to remind us of our intention. And, as a hospice nurse, sometimes one of the first things I say to people is, put down the club. Stop beating yourself. And that's a good thing to tell yourself, and something I remind myself of quite a bit. So we can begin to look at our thoughts in a different way. We can actually change the relationship that we have toward our thoughts by believing that they're completely insubstantial and transient, but also being willing to stay with the process of observing them and bringing awareness to them. Because when you're just resting in awareness, you're not so caught up in what's wrong or what's right. And I think this bears on relationships because, when we have any kind of relationship, we should be asking ourselves, is this beneficial, to the people in the relationship and to the wider context of all beings? And if not, then we need to look at it, be willing to look at it. So this kind of staying power I'm talking about is actually not turning away from. And a lot of our habits are about turning away from things. We click on the habit switch when there's a trigger usually for some emotional feeling that is overpowering or perceived as negative. And the habit kicks in often before we know it. So practice is one way that we can cultivate awareness so we can begin to look at our habits. And I say one way because I believe there are many, many paths to awareness and awakening. And that, Buddhist practice is one of them, but there are many other ways. I think Buddhism has a very long history and a very rich tradition in many forms that appeal to people, but the basic concepts of interconnectedness, of direct experience that we actually are all connected, is something I think Buddhist practice offers us. And it's not so much about whether or not you believe in it. I think it doesn't really matter if you believe in it because something has brought you to practice. Some idea that there is an actual true way to see the world we live in. And we call that bodhicitta the thought of awakening, the thought of enlightenment. And that is considered to be, like the only wholesome desire, right? So everything we do should be about waking up ourselves and others. And the Bodhisattva vow, as you know, is to sort of forego your own awakening to help all beings wake up. And we sort of set the bar very high, beings are numberless, I vow to save them, because you can't do that. I asked my teacher once, how do we save all beings? And she said, this is a different teacher, one at a time. And I like that answer. I could work with that. And, and that comes up a lot in hospice nursing because, we're often walking into very chaotic situations. I read this great article several years ago called The Myth of the Good Death. And death is often quite messy and chaotic. And there's something really wonderful for me about walking into that kind of situation and seeing what kind of calm I can bring to it, if any. Because that's usually what people need. And that's the same kind of intention that usually brings us to practice, is we understand that somewhere in all of our thinking and jumbled head there is a serene mind already there, fully functional, seeing the world as it is. I think we see this in children a lot, and hopefully we see it in people that we think are awake, that they have realized something, but it's actually something that's already there. And that's Buddha nature, right? Because the teaching is that everything is Buddha nature. So if we're not willing to see Buddha nature in everything, including people we don't like, then we're limiting our understanding already. And I think that we can break out of that. We can actually change our brains. And training your mind is the way to do it. So if you can find ways to encourage yourself to take what we call in Zen the backward step, make the picture a little bigger. Take yourself out of it a little bit. One of the ways I believe that this kind of activity is non-karmic is I believe that, we sort of cultivate a non-linear conception of time in Buddhism to free ourselves from the idea that things just happen one after the other and the past is gone and the future's not here. But I think the Buddha said something like, if you want to understand the present, look to the past. If you want to understand the past, look to the present. If you want to understand the future, look to the present. So all of these moments, these Dharma events, these discrete time-space coordinates are all connected. And once again, our awareness can lead us to a direct experience of that, the interconnectedness of all things. And the idea with Buddhist vows is that it's not that you decide, I'm going to take these vows and I'm going to be really upset if I break them. It's that the Buddhist precepts are the way an awakened person lives. So if you are harboring ill will, it's not necessarily right to think you're breaking the precept. But when you become aware that you're harboring ill will, probably you won't be for much long after that, if you practice with it. The awareness can lead you into how to practice with something if you're willing to sit with it and stay with it. So a lot of people find sitting very disturbing in the beginning because they remember things from their past, or they remember bad situations, they're not comfortable spending time with themselves, and they don't understand the contents of mind at all. And coming back to breath is the best way to do that, because once again, our little breath, which can be shallow or long or constricted or tight, is actually also the cosmic wind. And that pervasive attitude that everything's connected and we're a part of everything is one of the ways that we can use our practice to understand what is or isn't happening in our relationships. I'll read something I wrote here. Well, first I wanted to read something from Bankei, who was a very radical Zen teacher who lived in the 17th century in Japan. And he was kind of radical because he didn't really adhere to any one particular school, and he believed that everybody had the potential to wake up, and taught everyone. So a layman once asked him, he calls Buddha nature, he refers to a lot as the unborn mind. I'm grateful for your teaching of the unborn, but I find that thoughts easily come up as a result of my ingrained bad habits, and when I'm distracted by them, I can't wholeheartedly realize the unborn. How can I put my faith totally in the unborn Buddha mind? The Master said, when you try to stop your rising thoughts, you create a duality between the mind that does the stopping and the mind that's being stopped. So you'll never have peace of mind. Just have faith that thoughts don't originally exist, but only arise and cease temporarily in response to what you see and hear, without any actual substance of their own. I love that all Buddhist Zen teachings have just, or simply. Okay. Where are those instructions for just how to do that? I think that when I was also up in Oregon, the Zen teacher I did a Theravada retreat with Ajahn Amaro from Abhayagiri up in Mendocino. It was my first Theravada retreat, and it was really wonderful. And Jan Chozen Bays, who's the Zen teacher at Great Val Monastery in Oregon, I was very good friends with him. And I was having a practice discussion with her, and she said something I never quite heard before, but it made so much sense. We were talking about waking up, and she said, well, you don't wake up if you're doing sleepy zazen. And I never heard of sleepy zazen, but then I realized I probably logged hours of sleepy zazen. And I think it takes a lot of sitting to realize what sleepy zazen is. It's not really bringing awareness when you're sitting. You know, it's daydreaming. It's not being aware that you're thinking, and just finding yourself thinking in every direction. So that actually kind of woke me up a little bit to my own laziness in practice. And I think that we become intimate in Buddhist practice because we can see in the spaciousness of meditation that usually we have a choice between fear and fearlessness. And I think our habits are all about fear, and letting go is all about fearlessness. Because, Pema Chodron's really big on talking about this being ungrounded, that everything is ungrounded. And it's such a scary thought to feel that there's nothing to rely on. But then we remember Buddha nature that is all pervasive and everywhere, and then we see that even though things are just constantly arising out of emptiness or groundlessness, that arising is the opportunity for consciousness or awareness to know itself, right? So in relationships or in any two events, when the Dharma is coming forward, that's nothing's happening there, except being is arising, And why does being arise? Because that's how it knows itself. Because it has to be the representation or the actual thing of absolute and relative. And that's exactly what we are. And that's why our small breath is the cosmic wind, And we can know that and we can experience that. So this intimacy we develop in practice has to start with ourselves, just like the teachings of compassion and metta. You always start with yourself. You have to have loving kindness and openness and acceptance towards yourself. And if you don't, you won't be able to bring that to your relationships with anyone. So it's not self-centered and it's not selfish. It's looking at your own true nature. And we cultivate this intimacy just so that we can discover this Buddha nature. Because when we see it in ourselves, it's so much easier to see it elsewhere, in everything, really. And we get discouraged because we come up against our limited thoughts, or our mind that is lazy, or that wants an intellectual rationalization for sitting quietly, And there isn't one. But I think when you take this yogic posture, whether you're sitting on a cushion or in a chair, you allow yourself to free yourself from your habits and your self-centeredness. And that's a gift. It doesn't always feel like that, because usually meditation, like this woman was saying, it feels like it's too much discipline. But just like vows, we practice with them. We don't, not every period of meditation is blissful and wonderful. But sometimes it is, and that's an encouragement. But when we aren't having such a great time, we can also let go of that and just see it as what it is. We don't have to make up stories about it. We don't have to take that as the way we really are. A lot of what it informs us of who we are the ways that we see ourselves reacting in the world, not necessarily responding. The reactive mind, thank you, L. Ron Hubbard, and Scientology, is actually something that we work with in Buddhism, because when we're reacting to things, we're not usually in full awareness. We're letting our habits take over. So I think that the more we're willing to admit we have habits that could use some transformation, and the more we believe that sitting practice and other practices, such as loving kindness practices, can begin to wake us up to the way things really are. And the way things really are is actually pretty harmonious. At least that's what the teaching seems to be saying. And even though Suzuki Roshi said the problems you have now you'll have for the rest of your life, he also said when your practice is good, you're not disturbed by your problems. We all have problems. It's hard to live in this high-tech, fast-paced world. But we have these ancient practices to teach us that there's a certain kind of wisdom that we already possess. And so, in Buddhism, the big bird has two wings, wisdom and compassion. And in practicing compassion, we often see the wisdom. So we have to be willing to see everything as part of ourselves, and ourselves as part of everything, or else we make these discriminations and we decide this is good and this is bad. And here's another Zen thing, that the way is basically simple. Simply avoid picking and choosing. Simply avoid picking and choosing. Well, that seems to be exactly what we're genetically programmed to do. And in relationships, how many times have we had to learn the lesson the hard way that you can't change someone? I mean, gosh, it's hard enough to change yourself, as we all know. So, but we keep this delusion that if we love somebody enough, we can change them. Well, there are recent advances in genetics, and maybe that will happen in our lifetime. But right now, it's much more effective if we work on changing ourselves, something we can actually do. Suzuki Roshi said that to know someone is to sense that person's flavor, what you feel from that person. Each one has hers or her own flavor, a particular personality from which many feelings appear. To fully appreciate this personality or flavor is to have a good relationship. Then we can really be friendly. To be friendly does not mean to cling to someone or to try to please them, but to fully appreciate them. So whether we're talking about an intimate relationship or a work relationship or just a friendship, this is a good barometer. Do we fully appreciate anything, much less other people? And can we fully appreciate people? Can we accept them without judging them? And in my own life, practice has really helped me to be a less angry person. I'm sort of a perfectionist, and I get really angry when things aren't right. And I think I'll always be like that, but I don't spread it all over people's faces so much anymore. I still feel anger a lot, but I have seen that in practicing hard and being willing to see how, I inherited a lot of my father's anger and dysfunction, that I could actually work with that. I didn't have to just give up and say, well, my anger gets me into trouble, but that's who I am. That's how I was taught to act, and I was willing to own it. And once I owned it, I could actually work with it. And I think anything that we have a problem with is like this. It starts by awareness and owning it, and then looking at the effect. So I mentioned intention, action, and effect. And we have to be willing to bring our awareness to all three of those, because unless we believe that our intentions lead to wholesome actions, which lead to wholesome effects, we're going to keep getting off track. So I think that's probably about enough. Maybe I had one more quote. Here's a quote from the this concept of changing your brain is called neuroplasticity, which is a great term. This is from the book, Buddhist narratives have another consonance with the discoveries of neuroplasticity. They teach that by detaching ourselves from our thought, by observing our thinking dispassionately and with clarity, we have the ability to think thoughts that allow us to overcome afflictions such as being chronically angry. I guess I reminded myself of that quote, by talking about my anger. But I think the key thing here is that we have the ability to think thoughts that allow us to overcome afflictions. So when you're having a hard time with your thinking, create some space, recognize it as just thinking, and then come up with something creative that you can tell yourself to get you out of that rut. Whatever it is. And I don't know what's going to work for you. But if you set that up as your own koan, how can I be more gentle? How can I realign my thinking with my values, my intentions? Then you'll notice that in your daily life, things are changing. Thank you. I'm happy to entertain questions. Yeah.
This is the sort of the rocks that I fall on in my attempt to comprehend Buddhism. Do you believe there's an authentic self? I mean, I was at a birthday party with a beloved college friend last night, and people went around and there were toasts, and her siblings were there, and there was a unanimous description of who this person was. She was known and greatly loved, and there was no doubt that we were dealing with a known entity. She has certain transparencies and is quite exquisite. And yet, has her stuff and has many preferences. And though in exploring my own mind, I can see how thoughts come and go, and that there's constant change. Dealing with another person, they're pretty substantially, they're not nearly as fluid in my experience of them than my own mind is from within me. Do you mind?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. We can recognize personality pretty easily. So I'm not willing to say that this person has a great personality and everybody sees it. But in a way, we create the external reality based on our internal workings. So we share a lot of commonalities. So people can have similar perceptions. We all love a beautiful sunny day like yesterday. We all feel the same thing about that. But everybody experiences it differently. So the fluidity you're not feeling is because you're not allowing yourself to flow out into everything. To think that another person is different than you creates the barrier that may be perceived as not fluid. Everything is flowing. Everything is changing. The big teaching is that nothing is fixed, nothing's permanent. So no, an authentic self? No. Minute by minute we're changing. I'm not the same person that walked in this room and sat down an hour ago, because I've sat with you, I've talked. I'm different. Some cells have died. Maybe I've made a few neural connections. But I'm not the same person, and I'm willing to stay with that. And if you're willing to give up the fixed ideas about yourself, that you're fluid and other people aren't, you'll see less of the things that keep people separate and more of the things that make us similar. Just a guess. Did that get at your question or not?
No.
Okay, well, ask it again.
Because though you may not be precisely the same consciousness as you were when you came in, there is continuity. There's some continuity of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
At least that you're going to go out and find a way home and go home, and you're going to continue to teach, and you're going to continue to remember your teachers. And well, as I said, these are the shoals on which I practice with Buddhism, and I don't feel that Buddhism adequately speaks to that very major perception that I have, that there is some, not solid, not rigid, but a happening that has identity.
Well, I can't disagree with that. Part of it is that we make up really strong stories about ourselves, and so a lot of things that we think continue moment by moment is the machinery of keeping that story going. So Buddhism actually teaches us, as I mentioned, that things are kind of constantly rising and falling. But it doesn't mean that if I dissolve in this moment that I rise up in the next minute as somebody completely different. Yes, I have memory. Yes, I have personality. But I also have a sense that I'm not fixed and that I am fluid, like you were saying. And the more I've been willing to not think that whatever is continuing moment by moment is fixed. I mean, I'm going to lose memories in 10 minutes that I had 50 years ago or whatever. So that's all changing, not just physically and psychically. But yes, something recognizable as you or me lives moment by moment. We call that in Buddhism the great matter of birth and death. Birth and death is life. So our concern is, what is life? On either end, we have these big mysteries, which we may or may not be able to know about. And as a hospice nurse, I'm really into that mystery at the end. But I have no idea what it is, and I never kid anybody about that. It's very serious. But about birth and death, that I can study very intimately if I'm willing to not believe it's whatever I've been taught it is. I believe we can actually see the world the way it is, and we don't see it the way it is most of the time. And that's why we practice. And we don't have to have a goal there of, well, I'm going to see it this way when my practice is good. That's why Suzuki says over and over, no gaining idea. So just sit with that and see where you're sticking to yourself. There's some place you're sticking. You need this identity. We all do. But we can also let go of it a little bit. Uchiyama Roshi called it opening the hand of thought. We hold these thoughts because they're us, mine. This is me. But it's not, and we can open that and see that the thought just goes. So try that. That help better?
This is my process.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure. Clint?
I just want to follow up on this discussion because I went to I heard a talk that kind of dealt with this, but it says like if everybody in the world were enlightened, would everybody just be the same as everybody else? And even in my understanding of the history of Zen, the historical figures that were quote unquote enlightened had a different way of expressing that enlightenment. They still had one preference over another as far as and so I can see. I think I can see your point that we make ourselves a lot more rigid than we have to. That there's a lot more fluidity involved than we're aware of. But it does seem like there's an essence that reflects our individuality, even if we get to the point where we reach an enlightened state. One enlightened master might be kind of fierce. Another enlightened master might be kind of peaceful and tranquil. And they, in theory, they're both enlightened, but they're taking a different approach. That reflects some essence that comes from them.
Yeah, well, that probably reflects their ideas about what's going to wake people up. It's not so much about who they are, but it's their experience of what's useful in helping other people find this Buddha nature in themselves. So, in our tradition, enlightenment isn't the end, it's the beginning of your path as a bodhisattva. We have these experiences, not so much in Soto Zen, which is what I practice, but in Rinzai Zen, called Kensho, which is like your first big awakening experience, and some monasteries have big boards and they write the date of each monk's Kensho under it, and you can read about things like this. And that's experiencing the true nature in your own body and mind. But it's not the case, and this is what a lot of Dharma and Zen teachers are teaching now, is that these old stories that I was poo-pooing earlier, not so much poo-pooing, but the pebble hitting the bamboo, greatly awakened, well, that doesn't mean they went off and were, we have perfect, Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, perfect, complete enlightenment. Well, maybe there are some people who attain that. I don't know. That's not my direct experience at this time, check back later, but I have been around people who I can tell have experienced awakening and who have worked with it. But it comes out differently because our understanding of the teaching never ends. Enlightenment doesn't mean you get it and you can go out and help people get it too. It's nothing like that. Enlightenment isn't a concept. It's an experience of the true nature of reality. So it isn't a one-shot deal that changes you forever. I mean, Suzuki Roshi had his problems. He was very forgetful. He got angry sometimes. People have their personalities, and enlightenment doesn't really change that. But what it does change is your ability to control your emotions and reactions. But there's not a perfective, there's not a qualification that you become perfect in everything you do. So we're always working with that. And the reason in Zen we have to have the teacher-student relationship is because you need somebody to verify your experiences, but also to help guide you to uncovering your own true nature. The teacher has nothing to give you. They're not waiting for you to get it so they can go, now let me tell you the real secret. They're just watching how your awareness is arising and how well you're dropping away body and mind, and that's very important in my tradition. I know it's not the same in all traditions, but you have to, if you can't criticize your teacher or question your teacher, then you're probably not going to get much out of that relationship. So that's why there's so many different forms of Buddhism and so many teachers, but, Buddhism is always getting corrupt. There's always the age of decline, age of this. Well, we all live in the age of decline. So you have to find a teacher, if you need a teacher, who embodies the compassion and wisdom that you want to express. But that's why we see it differently in different people. So that's why there's so many teachers and so many, this one likes this teacher and can't stand that teacher. That's the way it is, So, yeah.
Something that you sort of started this with and then you were just talking about again is the issue of sitting without intention, which it's sort of one thing in Buddhism that I've never been quite able to understand. If I'm not sitting to, for example, decrease suffering or increase my compassion or whatever, then it would seem that since I make a choice what to do or appear to, it's just random if I happen to sit or don't happen to sit. Some people do, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Is there something more than that?
Well, I think that, when you really understand sitting, it's sort of like a big mindfuck because you're saying it's important enough to make time to sit down and be quiet and shut up. And your brain can't understand that. What is the point of that? So I think Dogen Zenji, who is the founder of Zen in Japan, was brilliant in the same way Suzuki Roshi was brilliant to give us no gaining idea, because what Dogen said was that practice is enlightenment. Just to sit down and take this posture is to express enlightenment. So if you're content with that, what else is there? If you're thinking, if I sit down, I will become enlightened, you already missed the mark, they say. So to have no gaining idea isn't, can you say how sitting down relieves suffering? Can you say how it makes you more compassionate? I can't. But I can say that what happens when I sit down is I give myself this opportunity to let my mind say, why are you doing this again? What possible benefit could this bring to anyone? And I love that, because I don't know the answer to that, but I've seen the power that comes from this practice in my life. It's not so much faith. I once asked this teacher, do you just believe until you know? And she didn't actually answer it so specifically, but she said this was a very crucial juncture for me. And she was right.
So perhaps one might say that sitting is a question rather than an answer.
Yeah, it's fully engaging in the question of the great matter of birth and death.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. Yeah.
I have a question about non-duality. We were kind of getting into it there before, and I was just thinking about the idea of nature versus nurture and that whole duality, and how now in the sciences they're discovering it's an inseparable tangle. And it's almost like they create, it's like my experience is that with pleasure and pain, that duality becomes untrue sometimes when I'm sitting. And so is this notion of non-duality is that we create duality, it gets deconstructed, we create another duality, and it's this kind of endless cycle. Is that what it means? Or is it seeing that truth in that and then experiencing that as just...
Mm-hmm. Well, non-duality implies two things, right?
Okay.
It does.
Yeah.
So whatever those two things are, like gaining idea, meditating, whatever it is, the training is to allow your mind to hold those two things without seeing them as separate. That's why we have the teaching of samsara and nirvana. We can't conceive or experience the joy that Buddha tells us is the natural existence of things if we don't know suffering. Because in our suffering is where we transform that into the way things are. So we can't just have nirvana without suffering. We have to have two things and see them as two sides of the same coin, or not separate. They're not the same, but they're not separate. So nature and nurture, causes and conditions, there's different levels and magnitudes, but they're all interworking together. And we can train ourselves to not have to see that as all separate. Without discriminating between nature and nurture, we can see that each has influence, right? But we don't have to take sides. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now it's time for announcements. Any Sangha-related announcements? Yes, Paul?
I'm the host today, and refreshments out in this room. Help yourself to tea, and if you use a cup, please wash it and put it back. There's a Dana bowl. Suggested donations $5 to $8. It's on this credenza over here, as well as I think some directories and some newsletters. And then many of us congregate at around 12:30 and go out for lunch.
Right.
There's a small gay men's meditation group happening the last weekend of March and the 1st of April up in Occidental, and I believe there's room for a couple more people. It would be a maximum of 13 people. And if you're interested in participating in that, you can see me after.
Baruch?
The speaker for next week is Jennifer Barrison, and she's a singer, songwriter, and a teacher. And I've never met her. My last communication with her was from Thailand, so she's performing all over the world. But she does wordless chanting and trance meditative singing. And she'll be coming next week to share that with us. So I think that'll be pretty interesting.
And it won't be the first day of daylight savings time yet.
Peter Hill and Daniel Latham and I are in the Awakening Joy class that Jim Broad is doing, and there's a couple of venues for class, so I was just wondering if anybody else is in that class. Maybe we could talk about that sometime. Thanks.
Excuse me. I'm directing a production of Moliere's Tartuffe that opens in 2 weekends, so I'm thinking maybe to give people lead time, maybe in 4 weeks we could have a Sangha night over there. It's in Point Richmond, which by the way is quite different than the city of Richmond. It's sort of like a little Inverness there. And it's a really great cast. And so I'll be putting more stuff on the internet. If you're interested, I'm trying to get an idea of, like, if people from the city would want to come over for dinner there. There's the Hotel Mac, which is this turn-of-the-century hotel across the street that has an American dining room this night. Or to just meet afterwards in the Hotel Mac to socialize. So if you have any ideas about the before or after aspect of this, let me know, since most of you live in the city. Thanks.
Any other announcements? Okay, I'd just like to say again, for the sake of the newcomers, next to the Donna Bowl is a sign-up sheet, a pink sign-up sheet, and you can put your name down if you want to receive our newsletter. I think you have a choice of receiving it by regular mail or email. And we also have a directory, which is on the other side of the bowl, and you can choose to be listed in the directory if you wish. There's no requirement for that. But if you want to get the newsletter, if you're not able to, especially if you're not able to come every week and you want to be included on the mailing list, please feel free to sign up. And I think that's basically everything. Any other announcements? Okay, so we usually close with dedication of merit. We have one printed in our newsletter, or if you have one of your own that you'd like to use, feel free. We usually stand and hold hands in a circle and then do the dedication.
We dedicate the merit of this effort of coming together and sitting together and sharing together and learning together to all beings, to people in need of compassion, to people who are suffering. May we be bringers of light and peace to all we meet, and may we be able to share the openness and love that is always radiating from our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.